Well, tonight we talk about all things strange to include ghosts and hauntings, UFOs, Bigfoot, and other strange creatures, Wendigos, glitches in the Matrix, shadow beings, and much more as paranormal author, speaker, and Northern Utah native John Olsen joins me on this episode of Passion for the Paranormal. Okay, so my guest tonight is John Olsen, and John is author of the Stranger Bridgerland book series. And John began having strange paranormal experiences at the early age of 8 in an old farmhouse he lived in northern Utah. And for about 30 years, John has been interviewing people and documenting firsthand accounts of strange events to include stories of ghosts, monsters, hauntings, UFOs, and Sasquatch. So, John, that pretty much covers it all.
It does, yeah. I've covered about everything you can think of with the paranormal. So
Yeah, and that's great because I cover all these topics as well on the show, and it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me tonight.
oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written a lot of books on this subject, so I'm really looking forward to getting into some of the stories, not only of your personal accounts, but speaking of that, I always kind of like to step back and hear your story and how this started for you. So I know this started at an early age. Can you kind of just step us back to that kind of the first encounter and how that kind of evolved for you?
Yeah, you bet. So I grew up in a house here in northern Utah it was over 100 years old at the time. It was built in 1883. So right around the time that I was adolescent, it turned 100 years old. It had been an old farmhouse, originally built by the railroad and then sold to some of the pioneers that came and started farming in northern Utah. And it had been in my family for since the 19 teens, 1920s, right, roughly around there. And by the time I was about 8 years old, I realized that there were things going on in my house that didn't happen in my friend's house. And I started talking to my sister and my brother. I have an older sister and a younger brother, and we were talking about the experiences that we had. And these things that included things like heavy footsteps on the steep staircase that goes from the main floor up to the second floor, and footsteps through the house, uh, things that would go missing and then show up again. And I even, growing up in there, saw a couple full body apparitions as well. And so it got me really interested in the paranormal. And when we were really young, my parents didn't like us talking about it outside of the house because they were so afraid people were going to think we were crazy that we were saying that we grew up in a haunted house. And so we couldn't talk about it much. And because of that, I went and just studied as much as I could about ghosts, and it just got me interested in the paranormal all the way around. And by the time I was a teenager, a few of my friends who had been over to the house, had experiences of their own, and I had to finally admit to them that I grew up in a haunted house. And what happened was I ended up telling my stories at parties and on double dates and just out with friends. And before long, the word got out and people started coming to me. And so by the time I was 17 or 18, I started collecting and interview people about their stories and collecting them, and eventually started writing my series quite a while longer. But um, and I just finished my fifth book and started on my sixth already. So it's been kind of a crazy experience all the way through. Um, one eh, one I mean, there was a lot of things that happened to me growing up, but one in particular that stands out is I remember when I was little, I had a little metal airplane, and I was playing with it, and I set it on the counter and turned around to get a drink, and turned back around, and my airplane was gone, but there was a little cap gun in its place, and I had never seen this cap gun before, and I took it to my mom, and it was from like the 1920s, and I explained to her what happened, and she said, "Just go play with that, cap gun." So it was just strange things like that that happened quite a bit with missing stuff and things being moved, and the ghost, which we kind of, as little kids, we called him the stair monster because the first things we remember is hearing the heavy footsteps on the stairs. Um, but it was very interactive, and it really likes to play tricks on people. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, that's a young age to experience this kind of stuff. Were you frightened by it initially? Talk to us about kind of that first experience you had. Was it kind of frightening?
I don't remember it being really scary. I remember the only really time that I got frightened was I came home from school and I made myself lunch, and nobody was home at the time. I was in middle school at the time. And I went and sat down on the couch getting ready to turn the TV on. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye some movement. And I looked and I saw um, this gentleman standing at the entrance to the front room, and I could see through him, and I couldn't see his facial features, but I could see he had a hat on, wide brimmed hat, a white shirt, and overalls. And he walked into the front room, and he sat down in the rocking chair across from me and started rocking back and forth. And I closed my eyes and I counted to 10, and I opened my eyes, and he was gone, but the chair was still rocking. So I jumped up and I ran outside the house and waited for my mom to get home. And that was definitely kind of shocking and kind of scary as a kid. But what's interesting, I found, is that growing up in that situation where so many different strange things happened and we just knew that the house was haunted, um, the more it happened and everything, it was more kind of interesting and exciting than necessarily scary. I don't think there was ever anything malevolent about the spirit whatsoever. Um, and even today, if I have an experience in the house, because my parents still live in the house, it's kind of more exciting than scary. But I can definitely understand people being scared by the paranormal, because my situation was not an evil or mean spirit at all, just more of a trickster spirit that I grew up with.
Yeah, you do hear of a lot of hauntings that kind of happen that way. I've had a few friends that have said that's, their houses, there's strange stuff going on, stuff being moved around, stuff turns up missing, and then all of a sudden reappears in the strangest of places. So you do hear this kind of thing, with other people's stories sometimes about the kind of the trickster kind of stuff. I'm curious. I mean, that's a lot of history there. I mean, over 100 years. Uh,
Hmm.
what were you able to discover who it might be? Any kind of historical research on the property or the land, anything like that?
Yeah, actually, I was able to find, when we were cleaning up and doing some stuff behind a wall, I found these charcoal paintings that they used to do back in the day before photography was big. These gentlemen would come around with charcoal paintings, and they would charcoal people's photos. And I found a couple of those in the wall, and one of them really looks an awful lot like what we call the man in the hat. And when my grandmother passed away, and my grandparents only lived a block away from me, but when my grandmother passed away and we were cleaning out her house and everything, there was an old photo album, and I happened to be flipping through it, and I came across a picture of my house back in the 1920s, and here's a gentleman standing right in front of it with a wide brimmed hat, overalls, a white shirt. I about fell down because it was the what we called the man in the hat in the house, and it
Yeah.
was a great grandfather of mine that had owned the house. So we believe it is a relative. It's my great grandfather. I'm pretty sure it's more than one spirit that still stays in the house, and whether he's the one that's the trickster or not, I'm not sure. But I believe it is relatives of ours that are hanging around from way back in the teens and 20s. The 19 teens, 1920, so 100 years ago. So
Yeah. And did you say the place is still in the ownership of your family?
yeah, my parents still own it. They still have it. About a year ago, my parents, with COVID and a bunch of stuff, they had some health problems, and so my wife and I sold our house. We lived further away so that we could be closer. So that we've been closer, and we spend every day there, helping them with something or another, fixing things. And since we've been there, both me and my wife have had experiences while being there. Um, I remember about 8 months ago, I was cleaning the basement because of my parents' health, they hadn't been able to go to the basement, let alone clean it out. So I was doing a run and getting a bunch of old stuff they didn't use anymore to take to the DI. And I was in the basement, and the first thing that happened was I was standing there trying to figure out what to do, and all of a sudden I got a tap on the top of my head, and I looked up, and in the rafters above me in the basement, there's a lot of old fishing poles, and one of them had been bent down and popped me on the head, and I just kept cleaning, and then after a few minutes, I felt somebody give me a push on one of my shoulders and on my back, and so I said, okay, I know I'm changing things. I know you don't like that. I'm gonna go give you a couple minutes and come back. But so we definitely have still had experiences in the house for sure.
Yeah, were there, I mean, any sort of messages you guys have heard? Anything told to you, said to you? I know you mentioned apparitions.
No, mostly, like I said, I think it's mostly trickster things that happen. And for example, my dad, this is several years ago, my dad had knee surgery and he couldn't sleep in the bed, so he had to sleep in the front room and in the chair to be comfortable. And several times he told me he was just about asleep in there, and he would hear somebody do the two finger cattle call right behind him, and just scare him, and he would jump up, and he would hear whoever it was laugh and run off through the kitchen. And so, um, even though it's not necessarily, it's definitely can be annoying. But like I say, it's nothing evil for sure. It's mostly trickster stuff that goes on like that.
Yeah, any paranormal groups, psychics, mediums ever visit the place?
My sister, she actually was part of a paranormal group for a while, and they came over and they did get a few things with a few voices and stuff like that. There's been a few groups that asked me, that was close to me, that asked if they could come over, but it's interesting because when they come over, it's almost like it doesn't want to perform for them in a lot of ways. It's like, as long as you're here, I'm not going to do anything. And and even though they've gotten a few things and heard footsteps and got a few recordings like that, most of the big things just happen, I would almost say, in chunks. Like you'd have a month where things are really active, and then several months where you don't have anything at all. So, but yeah, it's been fairly active house ever since we've been there. So
Interesting. Now, I know you cover a lot of stories in your books. Some of them, you and I were just talking before we started here. We both live in northern Utah. I think you're about almost an hour up north from where I am.
hmm
A lot of weird stuff going on in Utah. Have you had any other strange experiences, UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, anything like that yourself?
I've seen some strange lights. On the UFO side, I've seen some strange lights, but nothing that I could, you know, nothing I guess you could say to write home about UFO wise. Though I know there's a lot of sightings that go on up here, and I've interviewed a lot of people that have done that. When I was younger, well, and even now, I've spent a lot of time in the wilderness. Like when growing up in northern Utah, the family camped and hunted and fished and all of these things. And I have had a couple experiences where I was up fishing or hunting. One happened when I was hunting, and one when I was fishing, where I came into an area and um, I couldn't see anything, but it was almost as if sound was muffled, and there was a feeling of dread and a feeling of I am not wanted in this area, and I need to get out. And the longer I stayed, the thicker the atmosphere and the thicker the feeling was. Um, and that happened to me in two different occasions till I finally left the area. Is when kind of sound came back. You could hear the birds, you could hear the bugs, you could you know um, and then I had an experience where me and my youngest son were shed hunting, which is where you hunt for the deer horns after they've dropped them in the spring, or in the early spring. And we came across some tracks that were large. They were 16-inch tracks that came down a hill and then across, and we followed them. And they really, to me, looked like Bigfoot tracks, but it was in terrain that you couldn't get a really good, you couldn't see toe prints or anything like that. But it was in the area where there's been a lot of Bigfoot sightings. So, and that's the closest I guess I've ever come to seeing a Bigfoot, because that's definitely on my bucket list. I would love to see, a Bigfoot. That's one thing that um, I get really excited about, especially when I interview people and talk to them about their Bigfoot experiences.
Yeah, so of all these stories that you've gathered, and where you're at up Cache Valley, Logan area, Logan Canyon, I've heard of a lot of sightings, and I've actually seen a couple of videos.
Oh yeah.
And one, you may be familiar with this, but one was with a hunter and two hunters, was a father and son sitting in their truck, and they just filmed this Bigfoot-looking creature just walking along the trail. And they filmed it for probably a good 5, 7 minutes, just walking. I don't know, maybe a couple hundred yards, just on the ridge. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. I've seen a couple of other ones or heard of stories of sightings up in that area, but how many of these stories that you've gathered, how many of them are Bigfoot related, would you say?
Oh boy, I probably have um I probably have 10 first person Bigfoot accounts, most of which I've written about. Some that I still have yet to put in books. Um, but I have easily 10 different people that I've talked to in this area that who have seen Bigfoot in some capacity. What I find really fascinating is I've interviewed a lot of these people, and a lot of them had sightings in this area. I'm sure you know where, or are aware of, where Beaver Mountain, the ski resort, is in Logan Canyon.
Yes,
So
yes.
I interviewed all of these different people that told me their Bigfoot stories, and when you plot them in on a map, you can draw a circle, and Beaver Mountain's part of it, and all of these sightings happen within this area of northern Utah. It almost between Beaver Mountain and Bear Lake. You could draw a circle in that area right there, and that seems to be the hot spot, or one of the hot spots of northern Utah. And these people don't know each other, and they don't know that other people have seen Bigfoot in this area, and yet all of the sightings are happening very close to each other, which is very fascinating to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sounds like you got a cluster of reports going on there. That's interesting. Yeah, and it does seem to be a hot spot for northern Utah. The other one would be the Uinta
Hmm.
Mountains.
Yeah,
You do hear of
definitely.
a lot of sightings, and I've had a few actually. When I say sightings, not necessarily visual sightings, but sounds, and people have heard weird sounds that have told me when they're up there camping in the high Uintas. They've heard weird things. So you hear of those things. We've got Skinwalker Ranch just a couple of hours away from us. There's a lot of high strangeness going on there.
Hmm.
Have you collected some stories about strange going-ons in and around the Uinta Basin area?
Yes, I have. I've interviewed people like. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there, from ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoots, or Bigfoots. I hate that. Bigfoot. It's the plural of Bigfoot is Bigfoot. Um, but in one in particular, and I'm still trying to get this gentleman to allow me to print this story. But I was able to talk to him and get his story, but again, I don't have permission to print it. But when he was a kid, they were camping in the Uintas, and they just got to camp, and he ran off to go play by the lake. And he was sitting there, and he said he was being quiet and walking around the lake, and all of a sudden he could hear something. And as he walked around the corner, here's this juvenile Bigfoot. It was only about 5 feet tall, and it's going along the edge of the lake, flipping over rocks, and eating the bugs that are underneath the rocks. And he was not he was less than 50 yards from this thing, and he watched it until it finally saw him and then took off. But yeah, there's a lot of Bigfoot stories up there and UFO stories and um, skinwalkers and just all kinds of things that go on in the Uintas. There's also a lot of stories about the old Spanish mines up there and people coming across the old Spanish mines. It's a hotbed of the paranormal and strange for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, talk about a few. I mean, you've had some UFO encounters. Obviously, people have reported to you. Where are a few of the good ones that have been reported to you?
So I'm trying to remember exactly where the lake is, but up in the Uintas, there was a gentleman that I interviewed. He was a student at the University of Utah, and two of his friends and him went up to the Uintas camping, and they'd spent a couple days, and they'd just gone to bed, and all of a sudden their tent just lit up like it got hit with a spotlight, and they climbed out, and there's a giant silver cylinder shaped UFO hovering over, and it had a light beam that was coming down, and it almost looked like it was searching for something. And they watched it. It was silent, and it coasted across past them, and then over to the mountainside, and then they could see the spotlight, searching on the hill, and it just kind of, and then the light went off and they just watched it. It was enormous too, enormous in size, and like a round cylinder, and they just watched it as it glided over the mountain, and then another few lights and then was gone. But that one was really a good story. I really enjoyed that. They had a lot of detail about how it was almost a shiny silver, and the way it seemed to be looking for something was extremely strange. So that's one of my favorite ones, UFOs. In the new book, I interviewed a lady who lived in Vernal, and she was driving back to Vernal one night um, from another little town, and she was driving through a canyon, and I forget the name of it. Um, but all of a sudden, she came around the corner, and she thought there was a forest fire in the canyon because it was glowing red like that. But then all of a sudden, a giant ship, rose up from it, and she realized it was a glowing orange, ship right there in just outside of Vernal, and it coasted over the road, and then took off and was gone. So um, that part of Utah, and also up here in northern Utah as well, has a lot of UFO stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard of some in southern Utah. I've heard of, reports of, just in the greater Salt Lake area as well. I wanted to. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask about as well is any strange disappearances that you're aware of or you've reported on. I know David Paulides has written a lot about missing persons. You may be familiar with the Missing 411 series.
Hmm.
Anything that's been reported to you about missing time, anybody disappearing, anything like that?
Yeah, so part of what I report on, or some of the stories that I get, I some of them I call glitches in the matrix because they don't necessarily fall into anything else. Um, and that can range from a lot of different things. One thing that came up, I interviewed this gentleman who had this experience, and I'll explain what happened to him. He was camping, and it was up in Logan Canyon actually, and as a kid, his family would always camp together, and all the uncles and aunts would bring their family, and they would all camp. Um, and he had a cousin that was a couple years older than him that he really looked up to, and he would spend a lot of time with them. And one afternoon, him and this cousin and all of the little cousins and everything decided they wanted to play hide and seek, and he got picked to seek. So he counted, and he went out looking and found a couple of the other kids, and then he couldn't find his cousin, and he was looking, and not far from camp at the bottom of this little canyon, he could see somebody hiding behind the tree. So he went to go see if it was his cousin, and his cousin was behind the tree and was motioning for him to follow him. And so he walked up to the tree, and his cousin was gone. And then he would show up again further up the trail behind a tree or something, and just be motioning for him to follow him. And this went on for a while till he realized he'd traveled up this canyon a lot farther than they're allowed to go. As kids, they weren't supposed to leave that far. And he finally, started getting really scared. His cousin was still trying to wave him on. He could never catch his cousin. It was always just a little further away. And he finally yelled out, I'm going home. I'm going back. We're not supposed to be here. And so he went back and ran back to camp. And when he got there, um, his cousin's there eating a hot dog at dinner. And his mom chastised him for being late. And he said, well, I was following you up the canyon. And his mother was like, he's been here the whole time. He was hiding under the trailer while you were doing hide and seek. And it freaked him out because he knows whatever it was looked like his cousin was trying to get him to wander away up the canyon. It never said anything to him, but it looked just like his cousin. Well, I wrote this story, and I put it in, I think it's my second book. And I had a flood of people contact me saying that they had had very similar or very similar stories happen to them, where either in the mountains or in the city, uh, they had something appear to be an older cousin or an older friend trying to lure them either into the forest or into abandoned buildings, and they were lucky enough to get away from whatever it was. But the thing that stuck out is that they were all the people that contacted me after was like, I thought I was the only one that had this experience, and then I read your book, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not alone. And that was something that I thought was a one-off, kind of a strange story, but turned out to be a phenomena that I've documented with several people. Two experiences right in Logan Canyon, one in California, and a couple other places like that, where something appeared to be something else and trying to lure these kids away. And so I find that fascinating. I'm not sure if there's a connection, but there could be a connection with some of the missing people or the missing kids with David Paulides in the 411 books. I don't know, but I found that really fascinating.
Gosh, that's creepy stuff, and that's kind of that's kind of like a doppelganger
Hmm.
phenomenon. When you hear somebody sees either an image of themselves or someone else they know, and this is not the first time I've had another guest on, just maybe, I don't know, 2 3 months ago, that talked about a couple of his experiences with that, where he had seen a friend in a car, and it turns out his friend called him on the cell phone, and was in an entirely different location, and
Right.
it really freaked him out. Uh,
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I can only imagine that doppelganger and that yeah, is really strange kind of situation for sure, and can be really scary.
yeah, that's like I said, that is kind of a disturbing thing to think about, and makes you, when you hear of these disappearances and you hear of, strange things going on like that, Bigfoot sightings, it kind of makes you a little bit weary of going out in the woods, especially at nighttime. I mean, uh,
Mhm.
those kind of stories just are they're kind of unsettling. They really are.
Yeah, they are. And I know as when I was much younger, in my teens and 20s, I did a lot of hiking and fishing on my own, but knowing what I do now, I definitely would not suggest that or do that myself now. So,
Yeah, and I think if I do, I'm going to take David Paulides' advice. Always have a firearm and always have an emergency locator
yep,
beacon.
yep,
And I believe you can get those handheld ones for fairly cheap, but he says those two things, normally, when people have those two things, they never disappear. They
yeah,
may have one or the other and they still disappear, but for some reason, when they have both, they
yeah,
really never disappear, which
they
is
never
it's just
disappear.
strange to think of that. But he swears to that all the cases he's researched, when people have those two things on their person, they never disappear.
Yep, yep, that's
Um,
true.
yeah, I want to talk about. So let's talk about these glitches in the Matrix. So when you say that, by the way, I love the movie Matrix. But for the listeners, what do you mean by that when you say glitches in the Matrix?
So, I've had several stories of people that I've interviewed where things that the history doesn't match up with their memories of what happened. I'll give you a good example. I interviewed a gentleman. He grew up in Missouri, and he grew up in a smaller town in Missouri. And across from there was his house, and then a field, and then an old farmhouse. And he remembered as a kid that when he was around 12, an older couple bought that farmhouse that was across the way, and they had a decision to make. They could either restore the original building and turn it into something really nice, or they could tear it down and build a new house. And they decided to rebuild the house, then to restore it. And he remembered even getting paid by this gentleman to help restore it. And for years, he was paid to mow the lawn and get to know this family. And they'd even had the local paper had done an article on just how beautiful they'd restored this house. And he grew up and moved away, and years later his parents had moved away as well, and years later he wanted to show his kids. They were going through that part of the country and wanted to show his kids where he grew up, and so they stopped and he showed them the house that he'd grown up in, and he noticed that where this old farmhouse was it was a brand new big nice house. And he's like, I wonder what happened. So they stopped there, and there was a couple that was there, but he said what happened to the old house that was here, the restored house? And the lady that was there said, well, my parents originally bought it, and they tore down the old house and they built this one. And he said, no. He says, I thought. And he said, no, they restored it. And they go, no, they thought about it, but they really just decided to tear it down and build the new house. And he was kind of freaked out, so he even went to the local library there to find the article. Couldn't find the article. Called his brother, and his brother, he didn't remember it the way he did either. He remembered them tearing it down, and he was just really dumbfounded because his memory does not match what really happened or what happened here, whatever for whatever reason that is. Um, and so it's kind of that's kind of what I'm talking about when I say glitches in the matrix, where something happens that just doesn't make sense. Whether you remember it different, whether it's just something strange like that. That's a good example of a story where you know he swears up and down that it happened one way, but it didn't happen that way. So
Yeah, that's interesting in plenty of cases. I mean, it's kind of along the lines of Mandela Effect, although
Hmm.
the interesting thing about the Mandela Effect is it's multiple people that, hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, remember things a certain way,
Right.
and they're no longer that way,
Yeah.
and those kinds of things really, they kind of mess with your mind because there's plenty of examples where I remember things a certain way, and it seems like the overwhelming majority of the population remembered things a certain way,
Right.
and they are no longer that way. The Monopoly Man and many other things. I did
Hmm.
cover that on the show a long time ago. A guest on talk about the Mandela effect, but yeah, it's kind of along the same lines. But you're kind of talking about individual experiences
Right.
where people experience something different than there was something that happened differently than what they remember it.
Yeah, exactly. I almost call it like a personal Mandela effect. I interviewed another gentleman, and he grew up in Colorado, and he after high school, um, and this was back in the early '90s, so it was before social media and you can keep track of people. Right after high school, one of his good friends died, and he was gone. He was actually LDS, so he'd gone on an LDS mission and come back from his LDS mission and found out one of his good friends, she had passed away, and he went and read the article about her funeral or her obituary, went to her grave. Then many years later, he went to Utah to go to school, and then and lived in Utah. And like many years later, he went back to visit his mom and have Thanksgiving. And she said, I forgot the one of the toppings. And he said, I'll run to the little store and get it. There's a little grocery store. And as he's walking down the aisle, he turns the corner and runs into this girl, and she has a little girl in her cart, and he's like in shock. He's like, she's like, oh, I haven't seen you in forever, how's it going? And he's like, I'm good. He's like, weren't you sick? I'm like, the year after high school. And she was like, oh yeah, I had an appendicitis and I almost died, but I made it. But he remembers her not making it, and he even left from there and drove to the cemetery and couldn't find her grave. Obviously she's not dead anymore, but he remembers reading her obituary and talking to friends and everything like that, and she's no longer dead. She's no longer dead, lucky for her, I guess you could say. But that was one where a personal Mandela, where his memory doesn't match the existence that he lives in anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
My mind's blown on that one.
Yeah, that one is really strange. Yeah, he was in shock, you said, because he turned around the corner and just ran into the cart and looked up and looked into her face and was just like seeing a ghost. But yeah, and in his original world, she died of an appendicitis. It burst and she died. But in this one, she didn't. So it's kind of, yeah. Who knows what's going on or why that would cause that? But I have no idea. But it's that kind of thing. And I love those stories too, because like I say, they don't fall into normal ghosts or UFOs or anything like that. But definitely strange.
Yes, high strangeness. Wow, just truly bizarre. Uh, Getting back to the haunted activity, John, you got
Hmm.
a few weird places up there, just around northern Utah. We got 25th Street here in Ogden. I've done a lot of paranormal investigating myself. We've got plenty of locations here. That Union Station and 25th Street's got a number of them. Just speaking of that area alone, you've got the Nunnery up there.
Hmm.
You've got a few other locations. Any other places you've either visited or you've heard stories of strange hauntings going on up there?
So one of my favorite places to hear stories about is Utah State University. Is it's one of the oldest ones. It's actually, I believe, the oldest university in the state. It was one of the original ones built, and one of the oldest buildings up there is called Old Main, and it's the one that now has the A on top of it, and they light up blue when the Aggies win. And It's been known to be haunted for a really long time. I was lucky enough to interview somebody who had worked there for several years, and she was on the cleaning crew that would go in at like 3:30, 4 in the morning, and then work cleaning up, helping clean up until the students got there around 8. It was just a part-time job. And she said, like, one of the first days she was there, she was in the basement, and she's walking down the hall, and walking the other direction towards her is this woman in a long black dress and a brooch, and she had a stack of books in her hand, and she's, her hair is up, but some of the hair is pulled out, like she's really frantic, and she walks by and nods at the lady, or nods at her, and walks off, and then goes down and disappears. uh, After they passed each other, she turned and she disappeared. And she was kind of in shock. And she asked one of the other workers that had been there longer, and they said, "Oh, you've run into the librarian. We call her the librarian. She's always walking around the basement. She's in a hurry wherever she's going, but um, we just call her the librarian because she's always got a stack of books." And come to find out, after she worked there for several years, there was a lot of ghosts in there. Um, they move a lot of things. There's a one that she called the gentleman on the third floor. I believe it was the third or second floor, and he's in an old style suit. And when you come around the corner, he'll be down the hall facing away from you, and so you'll walk down towards him, and he'll just walk around the corner and disappear. But they never see his face. Um, and he'll stand there by the corner until you get close enough, and then he'll just walk around the corner and he's gone. There's also a sorority up on Utah State that's haunted by a woman who was in the sorority that passed away. And then the cemetery as well. That Logan Cemetery is right in the middle of Utah State University, and they have what's called the weeping statue, which supposedly is of a woman that lost a lot of children in the 1800s, and if you ask her where her children are, supposedly she starts crying, and you can hear a woman weeping in the background. And so um, there's a lot of ghosts on Utah State University, so that's one of my favorite places to hear stories and talk to people. So
Now, you had the experiences at the farmhouse. Did that prompt you to visit any other interesting locations that may be reported to be haunted, or any other experiences you've had outside of that location?
yeah, so once I started publishing my books, I got to know a lot of the local paranormal groups, and I've got the opportunity to go with them. My wife and I, we have done quite a bit with a group that did the Lyric Theater, which is downtown Logan, and the main theater that's um, on Logan there. And then there's a house attached to it, and I just all the names are coming away from me, but I've had the opportunity to go and investigate there, and we've um, heard voices through the spirit box, and hear there's a ghost of a little child that haunts the main theater there in on Logan, the Ellen Eccles Theater, and we were able to hear her down in the basement, which was pretty amazing. There's what's called the Whittier Center, which was started as a school for boys near the turn of the 18th century. Um, and that's very haunted with kids and some of the old students. We were able to go do that this um, near Halloween. We went with a group that went and did a ghost hunt up there. And in the basement, there's a ghost in the basement that of an old caretaker that really doesn't like people going down there. And while we were all standing there, I had this very strange experience. There was um, a room that's off from the side that they really, people go in there and get really bad feelings, and kind of get driven out of that room. And we were all standing there, and they were using the spirit box, and they happened to be looking into that room, and this old man's face came poking out of the shadows at me for just a second and giving me a scowl, and then going back in, which was really creepy. That's one of the only times outside of my home that I grew up in that I actually saw an apparition kind of thing. So Cache Valley is definitely full of haunted places for sure, though.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that would have been. I think that would have been probably a bit of a startling experience seeing that.
yeah.
Seeing the actual face that you mentioned. I want to talk about, I think you mentioned that you have a story of a Wendigo, which is a Native American kind of spirit, if you will,
Hmm.
supernatural kind of entity. I've heard it kind of associated loosely as the same thing as a skinwalker, but can you talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so that's one of the scarier stories that I've collected. That I interviewed this gentleman, and him and his girlfriend at the time lived outside of Reno, Nevada, and she grew up camping. He did not grow up camping, but he wanted to go do it with her to make her happy. He was a little nervous, so they borrowed some camping equipment, and they drove up into um, the wilderness up near Lake Tahoe kind of area, um, and they just kind of drove until they found a place to camp. And they were a little lost. He said they were a little lost when they found the spot, but they made camp and they ate and they set up the tent. And in the middle of the night, he got woken up with this weird sound. And there was a clicking sound, and then it sounded like somebody was just walking but dragging something at the same time. And he listened to it as it walked into their camp, and then he thought, being from the city, that what came to his mind is he thought somebody it was an animal or something. So it kind of went through his camp, and he stuck his head out the he unzipped the tent and stuck his head out with the flashlight and shined it. And when it hit the creature, he was just in shock. Standing facing away from him was what looked like just an emaciated body. It was somebody who this was all skin and bones, super pale. The skin was just hanging off of him, and it was facing away from him, and it had a hand on the tree, kind of like holding itself up. And he realized then that what it was walking, but one of his feet was kind of just dragging, like it was almost like a zombie. And at first he thought, this is a homeless person or something, and he called out to this person, and it turned over its shoulder to look at him, and it had black sunken eyes. And he he screamed, and this thing took off running into the forest, dragging its foot. And he just basically threw everything in the back of the car, and him and his girlfriend just drove off, and they were lost, and they ended up just driving to some place that was open enough that they could see around them, and just sat holding each other until the sun came up and they were able to make their way out. And what I talking to him and everything, and dealing with Native American folklore, um, what it could have been, what I believe, it being a Wendigo, which is a creature that um, in Native American lore, a lot of things are a real creature and a spiritual creature all at the same time. And it's kind of created when in Native American folklore, when somebody uh, it does when cannibalism is done, there's this creature is created, and it kind of just roams the earth looking for food and never being able to completely fill itself up, no matter how much it eats. And which is funny, when he was telling me this, and then later it all kind of clicked and connected, because if you think about it, he was not really that far from where the Donner Party had camped and they ended up doing cannibalism to survive some of the Donner Party going through there. I don't know if that's connected or not, but it's kind of interesting to think that this creature is wandering in the same kind of area.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's another kind of creepy. uh,
yeah, it really is. It's really creepy. So, but that was one
yeah.
that I loved.
How about stories of shadow people? Have people reported accounts of those to you?
Yeah, I have interviewed a lot of people who have had experiences with shadow people. Um, one thing that I find really fascinating is some of the people who've experienced shadow people in the wilderness, which I've interviewed several people who've had experiences with them. One gentleman I interviewed when he was a teenager had gone camping in Yellowstone and had walked out into the forest. It was with a scout group, and he walked out into the forest and could hear something coming. And when it finally cleared the trees, it was a shadow person, but it was really tall, like 9, 10 feet tall. And it's very interesting for me that the shadow people that people run into in the wilderness seem to be much bigger than the ones that they run into in the cities or everything. When they run into them in their homes or on the streets, which happens quite a bit, they're about the size of a regular person generally. But in the wilderness, I've heard people, I've interviewed people who've seen them in the Wind Rivers. I had a gentleman who had a group of shadow people watch them, him and his friends camping, and they were a good 20 feet tall on the ridge watching them. They kind of fall under the what we call watchers. Um, they seem to in the wilderness sit on the top of the mountains and watch you while you're camping. But that's just one thing that I find fascinating is that they seem to be a lot bigger in the wilderness for some reason, whether they're a different spirit or kind of a, a natural spirit, who knows? But I just find that amazing.
Yeah, wow, that's again another high creep factor there.
Yeah, definitely.
Some sort of entity watching you while you camp, and uh, wow.
Yeah.
Uh, John, I wanted to ask. Now, you get a lot of stories reported to you. Is what's kind of your? I mean, do you think there are times when some of these people are reporting or telling you stories? They may be the result of an overactive imagination. I mean, do you have some of those stories where you kind of you scratch your head, or how does that kind of happen with all these stories?
I try and keep an open mind whenever I'm talking to everybody. You can tell. I just take the stories for face value. It's interesting when you're interviewing somebody and they're explaining something, and you can hear in their voice the fear. They're almost going through the trauma again, and it becomes uh, very traumatic. A lot of times it's a very traumatic experience for them, and that puts a lot of stock into it. That's partly why one of the reasons that I make sure that the stories are first person. When I put them in my book, I try and hunt down the story, from the person it actually happened to, so that I can, put a name to a face, and I what I usually do, what I do is have them, sign a release, and I give them a free copy of the book when it comes out to say thank you. So I never pay for any stories, and so um, for the most part, I can really not think of a story where I interviewed somebody and I felt like, they're feeding me full. Um, and some of them, are like this one with the that I just told you about, the Windigo. It's it would seem really it seems like a very far-fetched story, but um, the more I interview people and the more I hear stories, even the more fantastical ones that are out there, I just get a feeling that people are experiencing these things for real, and especially when something like that happens, and then other people come forward having the same experience, it kind of validates their story.
Yeah, the more you hear from different accounts, but you hear similar themes. Yeah, it certainly seems to lend more credence to it. Absolutely, and yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you were to pay these people to tell you a story, then you would have to start wondering, whether. I
Yeah,
mean, then there's really a motive there. I mean,
right,
to perhaps kind of make something up or embellish or whatever. But
right.
so yeah, it's good to know that there's nothing, no financial reward or anything for them providing the stories.
Yeah.
John, I want to talk about, so you've got your book is 5 series of books, and the latest book you kind of branch out. So Beyond Stranger US.
Hmm.
So talk a little bit, just for a few minutes, about the book and the new book, and a little bit about what's covered there.
So every time I publish a book and I get to come and talk to great people like you, I get more and more stories, and they kind of branched out. The first My first book was mostly just northern Utah and what's called Bridgerland, which is northern Utah and part of Idaho and Wyoming, and it's just kind of branched out. The last book, Beyond Stranger US, I have a few stories that even came from Canada and one or two from Mexico. It's kind of just spread out, and it really covers a lot of different things. UFOs, like you say, UFOs, Bigfoot, um, and just all kinds of different. And it kind
No
of
problem.
ranges the gambit of all different kinds of stories. I've I've had several stories throughout about black-eyed kids. There's a story here in my new book about a woman up in Moose Jaw, which is clear up in Canada, who had a strange experience with two black-eyed kids, and it really just ranges all over the United States and up into Canada with all these different stories. And I just I collect stories all the time. My wife and my editor all help me, choose what stories should go in the next books, um, and I just choose ones that kind of fit in and feel real and are exciting to read, from people's point of view. And I just love I love collecting stories and writing, and hopefully I can keep doing this for a long time. So
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a fun thing to get involved with, and part of the reason why I love doing this show. I mean,
yeah.
I love talking about this stuff and all the different kinds of things we've already talked about tonight. All right, so I'm sharing the screen here. Threw up a copy of the new book, so there it is again. True Paranormal Stories Beyond Stranger US.
Hmm.
John, where can people find your work and find out more about you and what you do?
So you can find all of my books on Amazon. I have all of them on softback and Kindle version. I have a few that are on Audible now as well, and hopefully get all of them on Audible. You can find out all about me and all about the books as well on strangerbridgerland.com, the website. And it also talks about the different places I speak and everything like that. It also talks about my wife and I put on a paranormal conference here, expo here in northern Utah. We did our first one last year or this year. We're going to do another one next year. It's called Para X, where I have people come in and talk about their stories, and we have booths, and it was a lot of fun last year. We're really excited about doing it again this year. So all the information about that is also on my website, and you can also contact me through that website if you have a story or if you want to talk to me about anything. Your listeners can contact me through strangerbridgerland.com.
Okay. All right, great. I'll make sure to link up that website on the show notes here as well. And well, John, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Interesting, creepy,
Yeah,
spooky
awesome. Thank you so
stuff.
much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, really good to talk with you. And yeah, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And have a great what's left of the rest of your night.
Thank you. You too.
All right.